fini, c'est à vous.
Madam Speaker, let me put the introduction of this bill in the current context. We are a small island of 1.2 billion without much natural resources and our main asset being our human capital. Our financial sector contributes around 12% of our GDP and employs tens of thousands of people directly and indirectly, which we need to protect as much as we can. Prior to 2014, we were really a jurisdiction of choice for many financial activities. But since then, by sheer incompetence of the Jagannath government, we lost the battle and allowed our DTA with India, with South Africa, to be renegotiated against our interest. And other DTAs were just terminated. I cannot quantify enough the negative impact this has had on our sector. This has contributed in chasing away major international banks, like the Deutsche Bank, from our financial landscape, whilst others have aborted their venture here. To make matters worse, comme mes amis avant moi l'ont aussi dit, in 2020, the FATF placed us on its grey list. The trust that we had built over the years of constant hard work took a serious blow. It is very pertinent to ask whether we are still considered as a credible financial hub. We all remember 2020, when Mauritius was placed on the FATF grey list. Correspondent banking relationships came under strain. Transaction costs rose. The reputational cost was immediate and measurable. Investors asked hard questions, some walked away. Ce n'est pas une question abstraite, Madame la Présidente. Quand la réputation financière d'un pays est entachée, c'est le citoyen ordinaire qui en paye le prix, pas seulement les grandes institutions. We came off that list, but a country that has been grey-listed once carries a scar. This bill is, in part, the dressing on that scar. For that reason alone, it deserves to pass. Be it as it may, we are rebuilding and we need to re-engineer. However, let's be honest, we are duty-bound to introduce this legislation. This is an FATF compliance legislation. I'm not saying we shouldn't have brought this legislation, but leadership goes beyond mere compliance. This is a serious bill. It deserves a serious engagement, and that is what I intend to offer today in support of its broad objectives. We have to admit that we had laws, albeit fragmented, but it is on implementation that we have had issues in the past. Now, this bill takes us from isolated measures to 5 interconnected pillars: data strategy, asset recovery, transparency, expanded regulatory scope, and judicial speed. Madam Speaker, let us begin with what is perhaps the most consequential conceptual expansion in this bill. For decades, our regulatory framework spoke of AML, CFT, anti-money laundering, and combating the financing of terrorism. This bill now adds the letter P, countering proliferation financing. This is not an acronym change for the sake of paperwork. As we speak, the Middle East burns. Wars are being fought with weapons financed through structures that look, on paper, perfectly legitimate. The same instruments used to hide a corrupt official's kickback can and have been used to fund the acquisition of technologies capable of mass destruction. Now that proliferation is in the game, those who are responsible in the relevant institutions will have not only to look at where does the money come from, where the proceeds come from, whether they come from legitimate or illegitimate proceeds, they should also be thinking about whether the proceeds of a legitimate business is going to be used for the wrong intent. Maybe they are buying aluminum tubes, but instead of going for the manufacturing of a farm, it will be going for the manufacturing of a nuclear enrichment plant. Mauritius, as an international financial center, cannot be naive about this. We cannot say it happens elsewhere. Everywhere financial flows move is potentially a transit point. The addition of proliferation financings to our compliance obligations is a necessary, mature, and courageous step. Madam Speaker, I want to bring this discussion down to earth because financial crime does not always announce itself in the language of weapons programs and offshore foundations. Sometimes it arrives in a lorry, sometimes it enters through a port, and sometimes it enters with the blessing of the state itself. I refer to the matter of the importation of tipapier, the rolling paper commonly used to smoke cannabis. That was authorized under the previous administration. This was not a gray area import. This was a product of essentially no legitimate commercial application in the volumes imported, which was staggering and which raised no alarm bells, and without my dear colleagues then in the opposition, this would have remained unknown to the public. Madam Speaker, the volumes imported would have represented at commercial wholesale prices approximately 460 million rupees. The question was never satisfactorily answered is not just where the product went. The question is, where did the money come from? Who funded this? How was it declared? What due diligence was performed by the institutions that processed those payments? That, Madam Speaker, is precisely the kind of transaction that the amendments to the Financial Intelligence and Anti-Money Laundering Act now seeks to capture. The new provisions require reporting persons, banks, financial institutions, licensed dealers to conduct rigorous customer due diligence to identify beneficial ownership, to flag transactions that make no obvious commercial sense. A transaction of that scale for a product of that nature should have been a red flag on the first day it crossed a compliance officer's desk. Ce genre d'affaires, Madame la Présidente, n'est pas le résultat d'une erreur isolée. C'est le résultat d'un système qui n'a pas posé les bonnes questions. This bill is if properly implemented, ensures those questions get asked. Madam Speaker, I want to speak plainly about something that every Mauritian sees, and that our legal system has historically been unable to address. The person who drives a luxury vehicle that costs several million rupees on a salary that would barely cover its monthly insurance premium. The individual who resides in a property that by any rational calculation would require decades of their declared income to acquire. The family whose lifestyle bears no relationship to their formal professional track record. This, again, is not an abstract phenomenon. We have seen it so many times recently. It exists. It is visible. And for too long, our institutions have lacked both the tools and, at times, the will to pursue it. The amendments to the Financial Crimes Commission Act introduced in this bill are directly targeted at this reality. The concept of property of corresponding value means that when a convicted person has hidden or dissipated the proceeds of their crime, the state is no longer powerless. It can reach their clean assets, their inherited property, their registered vehicles, their legitimate investments to satisfy the debt they owe to the society. Je suis tenté de dire pour ceux qui ont mal utilisé les proceeds de la MIC doivent trembler. Madam Speaker, one of the architecturally significant reforms in this bill is the strengthening of beneficial ownership requirements. The amended Companies Act, the Cooperatives Act, the Trust Act, the Foundations Act, all now carry more rigorous obligations to identify, record, and report the actual human being who ultimately owns or controls the legal entity. We really are looking at the mind who is behind the thinking process and who is instructing the commission of the crime. This matters because the classical structure of financial crime is not a man walking into a bank with a bag of cash. It is a chain of legal persons, each one owned by another, each one incorporated in a different jurisdiction, each one obscuring the laws until the actual beneficial owner is buried so deep beneath layers of legitimate-looking paperwork that no single institution can see them. This bill addresses that. It defines beneficial ownership broadly and intelligently, capturing control through debt instruments, through differential voting rights, through the power to appoint senior management. These are precisely the mechanisms sophisticated criminals use when they want to own something without appearing to own it. I have the feeling that what this legislation wants to do is to be able to lay the hands of the law on everybody who can take a decision, who can cause a decision to be taken to commit a crime. I hope this will even go beyond that instrument. It will probably even go beyond, towards a big client who can account for 70% of your revenue and thereby can dictate how you should take your decisions. Madam Speaker, I must raise a concern that colleagues examining comparable legislation internationally will recognize immediately. In the European Union, under AML D5, AML D6, beneficial ownership registers are partially public and cross-linked across jurisdictions. In the United States, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network maintains a mandatory beneficial ownership registry with real enforcement. In Singapore, the Monetary Authority maintains an integrated supervisory intelligence net framework. What we have in this bill is still fundamentally a system of self-declaration. So when a financial institution is implementing a structure, it will potentially ask its potential client, who is your beneficial owner? And it will ask in the process to be provided with the share registers to ascertain who are the shareholders. And as regards the beneficial ownership, it can only rely on the declaration of the client. So we have a system which still relies on self-declaration. We ask entities to declare their beneficial owners. We do not, as yet, build in robust, independent verification mechanisms, cross-database checks against tax records, customs data, immigration information. We collect the data, but we are not yet weaponizing it. Nous déclarons les bénéficiaires économiques, nous ne les vérifions pas encore de manière systématique. Et un criminel sophistiqué le sait très bien. Madam Speaker, I want to borrow a distinction that I think is fundamental to understanding the limitations of this bill. There is a difference between compliance-driven AML system and an intelligence-driven AML system. This bill moves us towards the former. It does not yet deliver the latter. A compliance system asks, did the bank fill out the form? Did the real estate agent submit the report? Did the trustee update the register? These are necessary questions, but they are not sufficient. An intelligence-driven system asks, what does the data tell us? Where are the patterns? Which sectors, which structures, which nationalities of beneficial owners are showing anomalies? The United States, through the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, moved explicitly toward intelligence-led enforcement, integrating data analytics, enabling information sharing between private institutions, and creating a feedback loop between the FIU and reporting entities. Madam Speaker, some of the most consequential financial crime investigations in the world were broken open not by regulators, not by prosecutors, but by insiders. People within institutions saw something wrong, who had the courage to speak, and who paid a personal price for doing so. That is why countries like the US, they go further. They incentivize whistleblowers. To conclude, Madam Speaker, I would like to say I support this bill. I support it because our financial system must be clean. I support it because the person living in an inexplicable palace, driving a vehicle their salary could never finance, must finally feel that the law is watching. I support it because the institutions that allowed a cheap papier importation of that scale to proceed without scrutiny must now operate in a framework that makes that kind of institutional sleep impossible. I support it because compliance with FATF standards is not a technicality. It is the price of admission to the global financial community. And we have paid the cost of exclusion before. And we should never pay it again. Nous avons les institutions, nous avons l'intelligence, nous avons la volonté. Ce qu'il nous faut maintenant, c'est le courage de ne pas nous arrêter à ce qui est suffisant et de poursuivre ce qui est excellent. Madam Speaker, I thank you.
Thank you very much.